decentralized organization, which is not as new as cryptocurrencies. It was here before, and Austin is going to talk about the changes of the idea and principles of decentralized organizations after the invention of cryptocurrencies, how the principle changed and developed. So I would like to welcome you, and you can start presentation.
Great, thank you. Hi, everybody. Despite what Martin said, I don't actually have a huge name in the crypto space. So I'll give you a brief introduction as to who I am. My name's Austin Craig. I got started into cryptocurrency in 2013. I had been learning about Bitcoin for a couple years. I was fascinated by the subject. It was very clear to me that this was a Pandora's box that made new things possible that could not be undone or unlearned. And I wanted to get involved, but I didn't have a background in cryptography or regulation or economics. I'm a filmmaker by trade. And so I thought, I will make a film about this. And so me and my new bride, I was engaged at the time, we got married and we lived the first 3 months post-honeymoon married life using nothing but Bitcoin for all expenses, for gas, rent, groceries, insurance, entertainment, and travel. We went around the world using only Bitcoin, and we documented this in the film Life on Bitcoin. So if any of you know somebody at Netflix that wants to acquire a Bitcoin documentary, let me know. Happy to talk. Or if there's, better ways to distribute this. Most recently, I am working at Mainframe. Mainframe is developing a privacy, security, anonymity-focused DApp platform so that you can launch unstoppable applications on a decentralized network, and you can retain your anonymity and privacy. But today I'm going to talk a little bit about this book from 2006 called The Starfish and the Spider. This is an interesting book that was recommended to me actually by a Bitcoin YouTuber. Just mentioned it in passing, and I was intrigued, and I picked it up and read it. The book outlines this idea of decentralized organizations, which at the time was still a fairly new concept. The internet was still coming into the mainstream, and people weren't used to this idea of a decentralized organization. The book outlines the strengths and weaknesses of a decentralized organization, and you'll see that this was published in 2006. I think some of these strengths and weaknesses fundamentally change with the introduction of cryptocurrency. The book has a lot of interesting examples. And one of the big examples that it used that really stuck out to me was a discussion of Native American tribes. It talked about the Aztec Empire. The Aztec Empire in the late 1500s was a thriving civilization, hundreds of thousands of people, rich culture, art, commerce. The capital city of Tenochtitlan had 240,000 people in it. Every day you could go to the market where 60,000 people were buying and selling a wide variety of goods. When Hernán Cortés, the Spanish conquistador, showed up, he expected to find people in mud huts. He was surprised by what he found, a very advanced society. But it did not dissuade him from his plan. He was really there for one reason, and it was not to make friends. He was there for gold and for land, and he was very direct about it. He told them, take me to your leader, which they did, and he met Montezuma, and he told him, if you do not give me your gold, I will kill you. Now, Montezuma, can you see the skepticism in his face? Montezuma II was very surprised by this. He was like, who let this guy in here? How did he get here? And it was strange that Cortés was asking for gold. For the Aztec society, gold was for jewelry. It was not money. It was not a monetary unit at all. So it would be like somebody showing up here today and saying, give me all of your plastic beads or I will kill you. Like, okay, take all the plastic beads. That's fine. I have no problem with that, you weirdo. There was also some debate as to whether Cortés was some kind of deity, because that was a rich part of their religion. And so they said, on the off chance that he's a god, let's just give him all of our plastic beads and hope that he goes away. Well, just as Cortés was not there to make friends, I'm skipping part of this. Important note, Aztec society was a very rigid hierarchy. You had the king, you had Montezuma II, you had the royal family, you had nobles and priests. You had all the way down, a stratified society down to slaves who had no rights and no private property whatsoever. The unquestioned king all the way down to the slave. Very rigid, stratified culture and society. Well, Montezuma did not come to make friends, and he did not come to keep his word. He took their gold, and then he killed Montezuma anyway. And not just Montezuma. This picture is actually historically inaccurate. There wasn't a bloody hand-to-hand battle to kill the people of Tenochtitlan. They surrounded the city, they blocked the roads, they stopped the aqueducts, and they killed 250,000 people within 80 days by starving them and drying them out. The people died from thirst. This was not just the Aztecs who suffered this fate. The Incas faced the exact same fate when Francisco Pizarro showed up. The exact same playbook. He showed up, he demanded to be taken to their leader, he demanded their gold. They took the gold, they killed the leader anyway, and then they killed all the people. This was the Spanish conquistador playbook that they used throughout Mesoamerica, and they spread into South and North America. And they went unrivaled for about 100 years. Nobody could stand up to this until they met the Apaches in what is the modern-day Southwest United States. The Apaches, by Cortez's standards, were more quote-unquote primitive. They did live in really simple homes. They did not have rich art or a giant city or commerce. They did not have impressive architecture. What they were is something that Cortez underestimated. They were a decentralized society. There were no kings. There was not even a chief. This is Geronimo. Geronimo lived in the 1800s, and he is probably the most famous Apache. Most people in the United States would be able to recognize his face. They would certainly know his name, even if they don't know what he did. A lot of people would assume that Geronimo was a chief. He was not. He was what the Apaches called a non-ton. The non-tons were leaders, but they were not born to their position. They were elected. They were leaders who gained followers by virtue of their wisdom and judgment. People followed them voluntarily. Non-ton was an unofficial thing. You became a non-ton as soon as somebody started following you. You stopped being a non-ton as soon as people stopped following you. The Apache language does not have a phrase for, you should go do this, because the idea of coercive force is alien to them. People did what they wanted. They chose for themselves, and there was nobody in a position to tell them otherwise. So the Spanish showed up. They met the Apaches, and they were going to employ their same playbook. We're going to kill the leaders. We're going to take their gold. We're going to conquer their land. Okay, well, the Apaches don't really have leaders per se. Okay, we're going to take your gold. The Apaches don't really have gold. Okay, fine. We're going to enslave you. You're going to become farmers. You're going to grow food for our army so we can continue to conquer all the land. And some of the Apaches submitted to that. Some of them were coerced into becoming farmers and growing for the Spanish army. Most of them did not. The Spanish burned the Apache settlements to the ground. They were like, these Apaches are good for nothing. They don't have gold. They won't farm for us. Let's just kill them. Let's destroy their towns and their civilization, their settlements. So they burned the settlements to the ground. The Apaches, though, quickly learned to be nomadic. So their cities were not essential to their culture and civilization. Their leadership was not essential to their culture and civilization. They didn't rely on a rigid hierarchy. The Sioux were another people in North America, a little north of the Apaches, north and east. These are the people in the film Dances with Wolves. It came out in the 90s, was very popular, won a lot of awards. The Sioux were culturally very similar to the Apaches. They were superficially similar. They had a lot of the same beliefs, but they were structurally different. The Sioux did have a hierarchy. They had a chief who issued orders. They had a stratified society. It wasn't as stratified as the Aztecs or the Incas, but it was stratified. And the Sioux were able to resist European colonization for a number of years, but they didn't last more than a decade. The Incas were crushed in the Aztecs were crushed in less than 2 years. The Apaches resisted successfully for over 200 years. And it is exclusively from their structure as a society. That's why they were able to hold up against such an onslaught. So let's talk about the properties of decentralized organizations and what makes them so resilient to a head-on attack. First of all, when attacked directly, a decentralized organization tends to become more decentralized. So in this sense, a decentralized organization is like a hydra. If you cut the head off, you are going to get 2 heads in its place, which is very frustrating for somebody who's attacking who's used to a centralized body. This is actually where the book, The Starfish and the Spider, gets its title. A starfish is a decentralized organism. It doesn't have a brain. It doesn't have a head. And if you cut one in half, what you're going to get are 2 starfish. In the 90s, in the Great Barrier Reef in Australia, there was a group that was worried that starfish were taking over the coral reef, the Great Barrier Reef, and they were going to save the Great Barrier Reef by destroying these starfish. So they got teams of divers, they swam to the bottom of the ocean, and they cut all the starfish in half. And they doubled the population of starfish. It wasn't until some time later that somebody realized you can't just cut them in half, guys. You have to change the environment. And we'll talk about that in a bit. Superficially, a starfish and a spider are very similar. It's a central body with a bunch of arms coming off from it, but that's where the similarities end. Internally, they are extremely different organisms, right? If you're an alien looking at this, maybe they're related species, but as soon as you look closely, they're not related at all. And you can find the answer by going through a checklist. Now, the book offers a number of different things you can ask. Is there someone in charge? If you thump it on the head, will it die? If you take out a unit, is the organization harmed? Is the organization flexible? Can you count the participants? Do the working groups communicate directly with each other or through an intermediary? And if you go through the checklist, you can see that the Spanish army was 9/10 centralized, according to this rubric, and the Apaches were 9/10 decentralized. You can look at the same thing hundreds of years later by looking at the recording industries at the beginning of the 2000s and the file sharing companies. The recording industries were entirely centralized. And that's how they were used to doing business, because that's how it had been done for at least the previous 60 years. The file sharing companies fundamentally changed this, and they couldn't be combated through the conventional means. You couldn't sue them out of existence. If you did, and they did, right? You'll notice that Napster is not on here. Napster was probably the most famous file sharing app of that time. Napster was kind of centralized. Too much to survive. They got sued out of existence. But because that happened, because they got attacked legally and attacked head on, these file sharing applications became more decentralized, and you got Kazaa and Emule. Emule was a file sharing app that, like, nobody even knows who put that out. There's not a company behind it, and nobody knows who the author is. There's nobody to go after. There is not a head to this organization. So that one was effectively unstoppable. All they could do was adapt and try to compete. They couldn't kill it. So, properties of a decentralized organization: when you attack a decentralized organization head on, it becomes more decentralized. 2, it's easy to mistake a starfish for a spider. If you look at them superficially, they may seem similar. But you really have to go down that checklist to see which it is you're looking at. And this exists on a spectrum. You can have a somewhat decentralized organization or a somewhat centralized organization. You can play the middle ground. And a lot of companies now do that to stay alive. 3, an open system doesn't have central intelligence. The intelligence is spread throughout the system. It filters in at the fringes where the action is happening. And anybody can fill any role in a decentralized organization. In a truly distributed system, any single participant can make choices, can enact financial decisions, can enact functional decisions, logistical decisions. There isn't a CEO issuing orders down the line, right? It's different from a corporation. 4th, an open system can easily mutate. Because of this openness, because any participant can fill any role, they change rapidly, they evolve. They take on the shape that they need to continue to survive. And because of all those qualities, they can grow rapidly before anybody is aware of what's going on. This is exactly what happened to the record companies in the early 2000s. They thought they could sue the file sharing companies out of existence. They were dead wrong. File sharing is probably more alive today than it ever has been. All kinds of other things that we're paying attention to. There's all kinds of noise in the ecosystem, other things you might want to focus on, but they sure didn't kill file sharing. So let's go back to the Apaches and the Aztecs. The Apaches lasted for 200 years, but you don't see many Apaches running around the United States today. What finally ended them? It was not military conquest. It was not superior weapons. It wasn't some clever superpower that overtook them. It was this: cattle, livestock. This ended the Apache civilization. By the early 1900s, because that's how long they resisted, from the late 1500s to the early 20th century, the Apaches successfully fought off European colonization. But by the early 1910s, the United States government realized that we're not going to outgun the Apaches, right? We're not going to just chase them all down and kill them. We can't do it. They're hiding in the corners. They're all over the place. This is a swarm. And if we're going to defeat them, it's going to be because we change the environment that they're in or we change their society. So they introduced livestock. They showed up and they gave the non-tons cattle and said, here you go. I know we've been fighting for hundreds of years, but here you go. We mean well. Take these cattle, these rare and valuable cattle, this rare resource that you wouldn't otherwise have. By introducing valuable resources that had to be managed, they made the non-tons not spiritual leaders, not leaders on merit, but leaders like a CEO, leaders like, I have what you want and you're going to have to come please me to get it. The non-tons then could use those cattle to reward or punish groups that either complied or disobeyed them. By introducing a rare and valuable resource to a central body, they centralized the organization and society. And once that happened, you can coerce people. You just have to know the pressure point. You can coerce their leaders into doing what you want them to. This is a group of Apaches who were in Pennsylvania in the eastern US. They went from their traditional lifestyle to being corralled and put into schools to be westernized, which I'm sure this audience will appreciate the Apaches were not fans of. But it took hundreds of years for the Europeans to figure out how to do that, how to corral them. So starfish organizations, decentralized organizations, are not invincible. They're resilient, but they're not invincible. They can be beat. Let's look at how. One, change their ideology. A corporation is held together not by ideology. People don't get together because they share common beliefs and there's a fraternity there. They get together because they want to make money, right? Most of the modern world gets up and goes to their desk job because they're on salary and there are benefits. And it's not because they like the guy in the next cubicle. It's not because they're super friends with their boss. It's because they want to make money. That's what holds a corporation together, a conventional hierarchy, even in government. It's held together by money. A decentralized organization is different. It's conventionally, historically, has not been monetarily driven. It's a very hard thing to do, as the Apaches have shown. Decentralized movements historically have been held together by ideology. They're an ideological movement. If you share common beliefs with the other people in this decentralized organization and you act on those beliefs, you are part of the organization, right? You are part of that decentralized group. Have you ever noticed how when a terrorist attack happens, there will be multiple groups that claim responsibility? It's like 5 different terrorist factions said, we did this. It seems kind of odd. Well, terrorist groups are decentralized organizations. Maybe not 100%, maybe not entirely decentralized, but the activity is certainly being planned and executed on the fringe. It's not coming down from the high-ups. So when a terrorist act happens, when an act of terrorist occurs, it may very well be that the people within that organization do not know if it was them who did it. It's like, was that us? I don't know. It looks like us. We would have done that. I wish I'd thought of that. Sure, yeah, that was us. We did that. And you can see, when you look at this graph, courtesy of ABC News, that decentralized terrorist organizations were barely existent in 2001 when the September 11th attacks happened in New York. But because the United States government went after them head on, like what did they do? They immediately put a price on the head of Osama bin Laden. We're going to cut the head off the Hydra. That'll show them. Doesn't work. You attack a decentralized organization head on, you make that organization more decentralized and stronger. That's exactly what the terrorist organizations did. And they evolved. You can see that Al-Qaeda became ISIS, all the while splintering and growing with more and more factions all along. You can't beat a decentralized organization with a head-on attack. What you can do is, and this is a slide illustrating, it's a quote from the Washington Post, where people were starting to realize maybe this head-on approach doesn't work. The Islamic State, a splinter of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, or AQI, which itself was previously a splinter of Al-Qaeda, is one of many terrorist organizations that owe their emergence to the fracturing of a pre-existing group. Hezbollah, for example, was an offshoot of the Afwaj al-Makawama al-Labdanya, formed in the early 1980s with help from Iran in response to Israel's invasion of southern Lebanon. The Liberation Tigers of Tamil Ilam coalesced between the late 1970s and early 1980s from an assortment of Tamil rebel groups. These groups are very amorphous. They merge, they splinter. You cannot attack them head on any more than you could attack a swarm of bees coming at you. You have to take a different approach. You have to change their ideology. This is U.S. Marine Corps Platoon Commander Jake Harriman, who served in Iraq in the U.S. Army and then later started a nonprofit with the goal of changing the environment in some of these areas that are prime breeding ground for terrorists. His idea was, we're going to change the environment here so people have less incentive to become terrorists. There are all kinds of reasons that people might become a terrorist, but one of those is that they don't have better options. Many times these actions weren't done out of some kind of blind hatred for the West, but out of love for that little 3-year-old daughter at home who was starving to death. Although groups like the Taliban and Al-Qaeda were horribly oppressive, they also provided food, education, and jobs to desperate families. His idea was, don't kill the terrorists, give them something better to do. Create an environment where they have real options. So change the ideology. If you want to change a decentralized organization, change the ideology. Number 2, a second kind of attack on a decentralized organization. You can centralize them. This is what happened to the Apaches. If you can sufficiently centralize the group, you can attack the head of the organization. And this is arguably what happened to Shapeshift.io recently. Many of you may or may not be aware, but Shapeshift.io is an anonymous, until recently, exchange. You could get on there, you could trade your coins anonymously, quickly, easily. And they really built a name on that. And very recently, they announced that they will be conducting Know Your Customer for everybody who uses the service, right? You have to sign in. You have to use your real-world identity. There's no way out of it. Andreas Antonopoulos was disappointed by this, and he was not alone. There were many, many people tweeting at them, very angrily letting them know that you should not be doing this. CEO Eric Voorhees said, what I am writing is being watched very closely. Like, it's not hard to read between the lines. They did this because they had to. They did this because they were being coerced by a government entity. They had enough of a head, enough of a leader to that organization that pressure could be applied, and you could get them to centralize further. So you can centralize them. You can change their incentive structure so that they coalesce around a single thing and start behaving in the way that you want them to. Thirdly, you can decentralize yourself, right? If you can't beat them, join them. This is what the record companies did in the early 2000s. In the year 2000, if you wanted to buy a song, you had to buy the full album. You had to buy it physically on a disc. You probably had to pay 20 to 30 US dollars for that. In 2005, if you wanted to buy a single song, you went on iTunes. And that's why those platforms took off. It's because those companies learned their lesson. We need to be more like the file sharing applications if we want to survive. We need to decentralize ourselves, right? And again, this all exists on a spectrum, from purely centralized to decentralized to distributed networks. And I appreciate that this audience probably tends more toward this direction, and thankfully I think that's the direction the world is going. A lot of these previously centralized organizations have no choice. They have to adapt to survive, because new technologies are making this smoother and better all the time. So these are the ways you attack a Starfish organization. These are the ways that you can destroy a decentralized body. I think that cryptocurrency is resistant to these attacks. I think it's unique. It's comparable to, say, the Apaches, but it's not exactly the same. We can build things in place that make a cryptocurrency system very resistant to these attacks. We already know what happens if you try to change the ideology. If there is a schism within, if one group disagrees with the other on execution or philosophy, what happens? You get a fork. You get a split. And maybe that's not a perfect outcome, but it's fine. Like, people who want to try something else can try something else. Let them fight it out. Let's see which philosophy, which set of assumptions wins out in the end. You see this with Bitcoin, you see it with Ethereum, you're going to see it with a lot of other groups. That's not a perfect solution, but it's a heck of a lot better than one of them getting squashed completely. You can centralize them. This is more doable, as we saw with Shapeshift.io. You can centralize a body, you can find some pressure point, something like a head, and you can apply pressure to kill them or coerce them. But right now, a lot of novel mechanisms are being put in place and experimented with to address this. And an ideal crypto project has no linchpin, no central authority, and plus it has many participants, so it would be very hard to overtake the whole system. Some of you will be familiar with this, some maybe not. Decentralized autonomous organizations, initial coin offering, combine these and you get a DAICO. I don't know how to pronounce that, DICO? DICO. Now, I'm not proposing that this is the end-all, be-all solution to anything. What I am saying is that this is a very interesting experiment in self-governance, a set of mechanisms, a set of carrots and sticks to incentivize the right behavior. And if you get the right incentives in place, and if you get the system spread wide enough, this would be extremely difficult to attack. For those still unfamiliar with this, a Decentralized autonomous ICO is where the investors put into a smart contract that has a faucet to issue funds to the developers. Developers know that their funds are going to come at a certain rate very regularly. The investors and the developers can set beforehand, before any of this goes into effect, a series of milestones. When you reach milestone 1, you will get this kind of bonus. When you reach milestone 2, you will get this kind of bonus. And the investors have the option of turning up the faucet to increase the drip of funds, but they don't really have the option of turning it down. They can't cut off the developers. So that they can have milestones, they can increase the funds at any point along the way, or they can decide that they no longer have faith in the project, they can terminate the contract and send the funds back to the investors. This creates a tension. Tension may have a bad rap, but tension is good. Tension creates firm systems. This creates a tension between the investors and the developers where they each have incentives to follow through with their word. I'm not saying, again, not endorsing that as the end-all be-all solution. What I am saying is it's an interesting experiment in self-governance. That's the promise of cryptocurrency, self-governance. And as we build these systems, we find weaknesses and we can address them with experimentation, with variation, and see what's going to work to help foster self-governance. This is a video that I want to play. Can we fire that up? Again, this is not an endorsement, but I think this is an interesting experiment. Oh, we don't have sound.
And Decred have a 21 million coin supply cap.
This is for
Here's where
Decred.
things get interesting. Bitcoin's mining subsidy is reduced by 50% every 4 years, as shown by the stepped graph. Decred reduces its mining subsidy smoothly and gradually by 1% every 21 days, as shown by this curve. New Bitcoin blocks are found and broadcast by proof-of-work miners, who also receive 100% of the Bitcoin reward. This gives miners all the power, leaving users without a way to coordinate and change the rules regarding what blocks are considered valid. This leaves open the possibility for hard forks in the chain. Decred aims to improve on this by implementing a system of checks and balances on its proof-of-work miners, giving its users more say in Decred's development. It works like this. Once a new Decred block is found by a proof-of-work miner, the validity of that block is decided by a consensus vote cast by 5 stake voters. If a majority vote deeming the block valid is not achieved, the newly found block is immediately rejected by the network. If a block is deemed valid, then the new minted Decred coins are split 60-30. 60% goes to the proof-of-work miners for finding the block, and 30% goes to the stake voters for doing their part to secure the chain. Decred's hybridized mining system makes sure that its chain will never split. The differences don't stop there. 10% of every Decred block reward is placed in the Decred Development Fund. The Development Fund makes Decred a self-funded open source project, with no need for outside capital or an ICO. How the Development Fund is spent is determined by the community. Through the project proposal website, users get to vote on ideas to improve the network and select the development team to complete them. Decred is controlled by the community. To become part of the Decred community, go to decred.org to download the user software for your platform and get Decred on exchanges such as Bittrex and Poloniex. Decred, decentralized credits.
Okay, my point in sharing that is not to get anybody to go out and buy Decred. Frankly, I don't know that much about it. I'm not endorsing or shilling this. What I appreciate, though, is that this is an interesting experiment in self-governance, using the mechanisms of the crypto space, using stake, using mining, using all of these different pieces. I think there's probably a combination where you can create a very robust self-governance system that, if you can spread wide enough, would be extremely robust against any outside attack. And if there's an internal schism, first of all, Decred says that that can't happen with the incentive mechanisms in their system, but even if there is an internal schism, you get forks, and that's not the end of the world. That's another experiment in the space to try out this set of assumptions to see what's going to work. Lastly, decentralize yourself. That's the if you can't beat them, join them approach. And I think a lot of us would say that this is the best outcome. You're going to see conventional organizations decentralizing themselves so that they can survive, right? Maybe they're going to do it kicking and screaming. Maybe they're going to hate every piece of this. Maybe they're not going to be happy at all. Maybe they're going to try to game the system so that they secretly hold power, but they appear to be decentralized. I'm sure you can think of many examples in the space that resemble that. But frankly, I think this is probably a pretty good outcome. We have groups who are decentralizing themselves because they know that that's the only way they're going to continue to exist. A traditional consensus mechanism in a hierarchical system looks something like this. The king declares what he wants, the plebes get in line or face retribution. Consensus met. Get in line or I will kill you. Give me your gold or I will kill you. I think we have within the crypto space a variety of mechanisms that can be played with, that can be weighed and balanced, that can be experimented with. And I think it's extremely likely that there is a combination of incentives, that there is a combination of sticks and carrots that could create a self-governing system where no entity is going to have ultimate control, where you do not have to rely on a centralized body, where you do not have to rely on even a small group of people to decide something. And the results of these experiments are going to drive the institutions of tomorrow, whether that be companies, whether that be truly decentralized non-monetary organizations, whether that be decentralized autonomous organizations that true governance over a geographic jurisdiction. I think the algorithms that we experiment with and find to be working today are going to be driving those organizations tomorrow. That's my remarks. Those are my thoughts. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for the talk. I really appreciate I share your view in many points. So thank you very much. It was excellent, in my opinion.
Thank you.
I would like to ask first, because you talked about the whole theory and so. And I would like to ask practically, do you expect that big companies like Google or Facebook are going to decentralize themselves?
No.
And under which conditions?
I don't. I think a lot of institutions will, but it won't be Google and Facebook because they have too much to lose. It's the classic innovator's dilemma. They would be innovating against their own incentive models. They would be undercutting their own profits. A lot of people have said, like, man, Facebook stinks. Let's build a Facebook on the blockchain that's private and secure. It's like, I got news for you. If you build a private and secure Facebook, it's not Facebook anymore. That is a completely different animal. That is an utterly different beast. And it will behave differently, too. So I think those companies have too much to lose because they are leading the current paradigm. I think you're going to see a lot of smaller players, maybe even existing centralized players, adapt and evolve to fill those niches.
So you think that if we really will be searching for a decentralized platform, which is like a current problem we are solving, we would like to switch, as a parallel Polis, we would like to switch from Facebook to some alternative, but we really made a large research and there is nothing that would really work for this purpose.
Yeah.
So what has to happen to change the conditions?
I think
your opinion in terms of your...
Right now, and this won't come as much surprise to people here, but right now we are in such an early stage developing the next version of the web. We are still laying the infrastructure. Facebook is an application. At least it started as an application. It started in Converge on an infrastructure project now because they're like a freaking parasite. They're taking over the entire internet. There are regions of the world where Facebook and internet are effectively synonymous to an average user. They think they're the same thing because Facebook has its tendrils everywhere. What I think needs to happen before you have a viable competitor is you need to build the basic infrastructure that allows for something like the social graph, right? All of your information that's stored in a silo at Facebook needs to be stored in some kind of system where A, you have autonomous control over it, you get to dictate who gets access to it, and B, there are actual mechanisms for other entities to access it. If you decided today that you wanted to share your Facebook information with a third party, that only happens if Facebook also agrees to it. At the end of the day, with this new version of the web that's being built, and this is what the company that I'm working for is trying to build, some of the basic infrastructure.
Yep.
Ideally, you will be able to dictate exactly what happens to that, and there will be no third parties that get to insert themselves into the conversation.
Thank you very much. And now, of course, your turn. You got possibility to ask.
I know you're all very interested in asking about Native American tribes.
So please raise your hands. I will pass the mic to you.
Thank you for the very interesting presentation. Based on, I guess, some of the research that you've done in this area, what would you say is the most successful decentralized organization today?
Oh, that's a good question. That's rough because I feel like maybe you have something in mind, maybe you don't, but I feel like an ideal answer would be like, oh, you should check out this project. They're super decentralized and they're killing it. I don't think that exists. I think there are some legacy decentralized organizations that have done a good job. This book also cited Alcoholics Anonymous as an interesting decentralized organization. There was not a central body. If you wanted to start an Alcoholics Anonymous group, you just did it. You just got a bunch of alcoholics together and start talking. And you didn't have to get anybody's permission to do that. Dang, I don't know. Does anybody else have a good answer for that? What is the most successful decentralized organization today?
Wait for Mike.
Maybe I will say Morningstar in the US.
Morningstar?
Yeah, those are the vegetable producers.
Okay.
In California, and maybe a Buurtzorg,
Okay.
daily care in Netherlands. Also 10,000 nurses taking care of others.
Right. One thing that this opened my eyes to is that decentralized organizations are not just a crypto thing. They're not just a software, open source software thing. Decentralized organizations have existed for a long time. They just often get overlooked, or we haven't historically had a good way to understand or categorize them. So you're talking about produce producers, is that a thing? Yeah, there can be all kinds of decentralized organizations, and they might have nothing to do with software. But open source software certainly lends itself to that.
As you mentioned, the terroristic organizations may be inspiring too in terms of their strategies.
Yeah, yeah.
Another question.
P.S. If you guys know of organizations that are doing really interesting experiments in self-governance specifically, how to create a truly distributed system where there is no central body calling the shots, I'm interested and eager to hear about those. So don't hesitate to let me know if you're aware of something that I'm not.
So what do you think about Bitcoin? Like how the changes get merged and it's based on merit. If
Right.
the others in the community review your pull requests, and do you think that's a good model of a decentralized organization?
At the end of the day, there's the big question of whether or not something works, right? And an ideal is different from what actually works, from what is practical in the real world. There are some elements of Bitcoin's development that I think you could absolutely classify as more centralized than not. But if it works, and if it's a better alternative than anything else out there, I'm not going to be too critical. I like Bitcoin. I've been into Bitcoin for 5+ years at this point. I still hodl. I'm into it. I like it. Do I think it could be better? Yeah. I think a lot of people agree with me there. I think we all know that it could be better. It's under constant development. There's not a static state of any of these things. So, I mean, can I identify areas where it could probably improve? Yeah, I think a lot of us could. But at the same time, if it's a better alternative, I'll take it.
So how do you think you could improve something that has to be done slowly? As you play with a lot of money, if a change gets merged and it contains a bug or something that might hurt the system.
Yeah, that's a good question. I've used the phrase self-governance a lot in this, and I think that there are a lot of ways that you can play with that idea. I don't know. Like, if there are concrete proposals here, I'm eager to hear them, but I don't have concrete proposals on how to improve the process of creating the Bitcoin code.
Thank you for impressive talk. I've just a question. Let's say I would like to set up some business, or I'm currently operating a company, and I would like to turn it into as much decentralized organization as possible. So could you recommend maybe some manual, some book, something that could be even present to the people who would, ask me, I would like to do the same.
Right.
Because I know there is a lot of presentation talks and so on, but something really strategical to do it. You know, if you have some tip,
Right.
some recommendation.
Obvious answer is to read this book from where I'm pulling a lot of these thoughts. The Starfish and the Spider, published in 2006. It's an easy and it's a short read. It's not going to be over anyone's head in this audience. The other thing that I would recommend is if you are really planning on having a distributed organization that does not have a rigid hierarchy, you have to hire the right people. You have to work with people who are of the same mind, who have one heart and one mind. Because if you have people who are going to disagree on execution, and if everybody has power to execute, you're going to get fractured behavior. You're going to get splinters. You're going to get forks. You have to be very careful who you allow to be part of that unit. Because the idea is this unit acts as one. It thinks as one. The ideology is the organization. So, you know, this isn't specific reading that I'm advising to you, but I would say you have to be very careful who becomes part of that group. Because if it's voluntary, if it's distributed power, you have to really trust the people you're working with to follow through. And maybe they're not going to do it exactly the way you would, but toward the same ends and in means that you agree with.
And if I can recommend some books also.
Yes, by all means.
So if you're into business, then I would definitely recommend Organize for Complexity from Niels Flagging, which is like 200 pages book and really nice way how to actually start from the very beginning. And also if you have existing enterprise, how to turn it into sort of in such a decentralized organization if possible. Then the next great book is Freedom Incorporated, which is describing stories of Morningstar, as I mentioned, also Harley Davidson and Fave, you know, like big corporates, not only software companies, but also like production companies. And then there is a really nice PDF, which is freely available about how Pirate Party in Sweden has been made really successful, going from really being an unknown party in Sweden and made it up all the way up to European Parliament, which is called Swarmwise. So you can download it straight away, and a bunch of interesting...
an exchange and the process of making it. So go check those guys out.
Thank you very much. Austin, some last word you want to add?
Just thank you. I'm sure this room has a lot more wisdom and knowledge on the subject than one person does. So if you have recommendations, I'm going to come ask for these book titles again from you guys. But there's plenty more to learn on the subject, and we are in. Jimmy Song, I was just in Jimmy Song's talk, and he presented a couple ideas that were really interesting. And this, I didn't plan this at all, but this is kind of a counter narrative to a lot of what he was saying. If you look at the two side by side, I think we're seeing a lot of really interesting stuff right now that will produce super surprising conclusions for how self-governance can be achieved.
Thank you very much. And I appreciate you took part in our Congress.
Thanks.
Thank you.